Hi there, fourth graders. Today in reading, we are going to continue to read the story Nubs that we started last week. As we are reading, I want you to still focus on those different filters. I know we've had Thanksgiving break. I know maybe we're not ready to come back to school yet, but remember we talked about those filters last week. The story actually doesn't change itself. It's just the way that we're looking at the story. That's the only thing that changes. Remember when Mike showed us with the phone filters, the photo itself of his dog didn't actually change. Only like the colors did. And so when we read this story, I want you to put on those filters for the plot, for where the story is taking place, the setting, and different main characters, and overall thinking after thinking about the plot, like what happens in the story, the filter or not the filters, the main characters and the setting, how does that tell me what the main idea of this story is? So we are going to recap what we read. Last time we met him, and he lives in Iraq, and he's a war dog, and he was eating mice and scraps over by the fort. And then we met Major Brian Dennis, and he kind of started to like, oh, okay, maybe these dogs are not so scary. And he pet him, and he called him Nubs because he didn't have any ears, and so that's why he called them Nubs, and that is where we left off. I'm pretty sure. No, I think we read this too. Yeah, I call him Nubs because his ears look like little nubs. And then we'll just start right here. So, thinking about the characters, thinking about the setting, and thinking about what happens, the plot. That night, Nubs and Brian ate dinner together. They shared Brian's MREs, or meal ready to eat, of spaghetti and Cajun beans and rice. For dessert, Nubs sampled a strawberry Pop-Tart, wagging his tail. Later that evening, Nubs stayed with Brian when it was his turn to guard duty. Together, they kept everyone safe. The next day, Brian gave Nubs an extra long belly rub. Then he stepped into his Humvee and drove away. The whole pack chased after the vehicles, but quickly lost interest and turned back. Not Nubs. Running faster and faster, he tried to catch up with Brian. He ran for more than a mile. He had no way of knowing that it was against the rules for Marines to have pets. Left behind, Nubs stared after the Humvees as they disappeared into the shimmering heat of the desert. Oh, so I don't think we've just found out that the Marines aren't allowed to have animals. So this is kind of maybe make our plot a little bit sticky. What's actually going to happen? Long, lonely weeks passed without any sight of that trio of the Humvees and Marines called Scout, Boss, and Chuck. At the fort without Brian, there were no belly rubs. Winter cold winds began to scour the desert, leaving Nubs scrambling for someplace warm to sleep. As the pack leader, he faced constant challenges from younger dogs wanting his job. Sometimes groups of dogs from other forts fought Nubs and his pack over the little food that they had. Nubs lived in a rough, harsh life, waiting for each time Boss carried back Brian to him. At the fort without Brian, there were no belly rubs. We have a little sidebar up here, and it's an email from Brian Dennis. Subject, Nubs. Date, November 2007. On our last trip north, I was expecting to see Nubs again. We didn't make it as far north as we did last trip, but I thought that I'd see him. I hope that crazy little dog is okay. Near the end of December, when the temperature dipped to a bone-chilling 30 degrees, the Humvees again rumbled up to the border fort. The pack dogs ran to greet Brian, but not Nubs. He hung back, gaunt and weak from a deep wound in his side. Shivering from the pain, Nubs allowed Brian and the team medic to clean the wound and apply an antiseptic ointment from the men's first aid kits. He even swallowed the child-sized dose of antibiotic Brian gave him, but Nubs refused to eat or drink. It hurt so much he tried to sleep standing up. And here's another little email that we've got from Brian Dennis. Subject: bad news, December 2007. We tried to put a blanket on Nubs when we bedded down for the night in the desert, but he wouldn't let us. I said a prayer for him. He slept near me. It got down to 18 degrees that night, and I kept waking up to check on him. Every time I woke up, I wondered if he'd be alive. When Brian got up at 4 a.m. for his turn at watch, Nubs stiffly padded into place beside him. Head and tail drooping, he faithfully made the rounds with Brian. The next day, Nubs watched as Brian and his team prepared to leave. He touched his nose in Brian's face, and as Brian bent down to bid him goodbye, he felt Brian's head on his and heard him whisper, "Hey, buddy, you need to eat. You gotta get better." Then Brian climbed into Boss, and the three Humvees pulled away, determined not to be left behind again. Nubs chased after Brian. He couldn't keep up. Alone, he returned to the fort. Two long weeks later, Scout, Boss, and Chuck thundered up to Nubs' fort again. This time, Nubs was there to greet them, tail wagging but still moving slowly. For a few peaceful days, Nubs stuck close to his human pack. Brian took special care of him, doctoring his wound every morning. Nubs gobbled up his share of Brian's MREs, especially the beef patties. They wrestled and played, "Give me 5." Brian rubbed Nubs' belly every time he asked. If Brian stopped too soon, Nubs pawed him and made him rub some more. Each night after the sun set over the desert, Nubs and Brian did their jobs together. Under an ice-black sky of 1,000 stars, they kept watch over everyone. All too soon, it was time for Brian to leave again. Nubs followed close on his heels. Brian tightened his winter scarf, a keffiyeh, around his neck, and Glenn climbed inside the Humvee. He leaned out and said to Nubs, "You take care of yourself, buddy." The vehicles rolled across the desert slowly at first, then picking up speed, heading for the command outpost, far away on the Jordanian border. Nubs cried as he chased them across the cold, coarse sand. Because of his wound, he could not keep up. He dropped to the ground, exhausted and completely alone. And it looks like it's Brian. When Nubs sat up, Scout, Boss, and Chuck were out of sight. He struggled to his feet and began walking. Nubs trekked mile after treacherous mile across the desert, shivering through the frozen days and nights. There were little to eat and even less to drink. With barely a moment's rest, Nubs pushed on, fighting his way through the territories fiercely protected by wolves and wild dogs. This is where they started. And then this is the path that he took all the way to Jordan, where Brian was. 2 snowy days and 70 miles later, Nubs limped to Iraqi battalion headquarters, where Brian was working. A team of members ran inside, shouting to Brian, "You're not going to believe who's here." "What are you doing here?" When Nubs saw Brian, he ran with his tongue out and tail wagging right into his arms. "What are you doing here?" Brian said as he held Nubs close and rubbed him all over. Finally, Nubs felt warm again. He pressed his wet nose against Brian's cheek. Nubs watched Brian climb into Boss, ordering his team back to the command outpost just a half-mile away. "I know we're not supposed to have dogs at the outpost," Brian said to his men, "but if he follows us, what can we do?" So, that's all we're going to read for today. I want you guys to think about what main characters were talked about, where did this take place, what happened, what was the plot, the events that happened, and then overall, how do those 3 things connect to the main idea or what this part of Nubs was about?